Hi, my name is Tracey Heisler, and I'm Executive Director for CASA of Somerset, Hunterdon, and Warren counties. And I'm here this morning to talk to you about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Trauma that in childhood can have an impact over the lifespan, and we feel like it's really important to share the information with the community at large and hope that it will help you in your daily life if this is something that you have had to deal with, either for yourself or with others. So we're going to start with some fundamentals of what exactly does being trauma-informed look like? What does that mean? So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Wing of the federal government, or SAMHSA, defines being trauma-informed in 4 parts. Part 1 is to realize the prevalence of trauma. Part 2 is to recognize the impacts of trauma. Part 3 is to respond in a trauma-informed way. And Part 4 is to resist re-traumatization of somebody who's experienced things. So we're going to look at each one of these variables. So let's talk even more fundamentally about what is trauma. We think about things like a car accident or a robbery or a hurricane. Those are all traumatic experiences, and they can result in post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. So what we're talking about now is actually developmental trauma. And developmental trauma can occur in a number of different ways, but the thing that differentiates it from a single event trauma is that it happens repeatedly over time. Some examples of issues that could create developmental trauma are things like physical or sexual abuse in the home that happens repeatedly, domestic violence within the home, poverty, neglect. All of those things can have an impact. But again, the thing that differentiates it is it happens repeatedly over time. So we have to go back to the 1990s to understand the foundations of this research. There were 2 epidemiologists from the CDC, Drs. Anda and Folletti, who partnered with Kaiser Permanente to look into what were the factors that were contributing to obesity within a population. As they were collecting the background information and data, one of the things that they found that kept coming up repeatedly were histories of child abuse or neglect, these developmental traumas that we were just talking about. So they started collecting data from their sample of about 17,000 Californians who were largely white, largely well-educated, and had health insurance. From that data that they collected, they developed a 10-question questionnaire that they administered to this population. And it covered 3 domains: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Within each of those categories, they looked at physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. They looked at physical and emotional neglect. And then within household dysfunction, they looked at whether there was domestic violence, whether somebody had been incarcerated, whether somebody had mental health issues, if there was divorce, things along that line. So one of the things that they found as they assessed these 17,000 participants and looked through the data is that 36%, roughly a little more than a third, had 0 ACEs, which was wonderful, right? That they had no negative childhood experiences. 26% had 1, 16% had 2, 9% had 3, 12% had 4 or more. So if we break that down, 64% of the people that they interviewed had at least 1 ACE, 1 adverse childhood experience. So there was a follow-up study. There have been a number of follow-up studies that replicate this data, but there was one that I really wanted to mention from 2018 that had a sample size of more than 214,000 participants. It was ginormous, right? And it came out with essentially the same, that 1 in 4 adults had 3 or more ACEs, but the numbers were significantly higher if you were Black, if you were Hispanic, if you were multiracial, if you were bisexual, gay, lesbian, part of the LGBTQ community, and you had a lower socioeconomic status, hadn't finished high school, didn't make a lot of money, had a disability and were unable to work. So we know from this that in every classroom in the country, 1 out of 4 kids on average have experienced trauma. So what does that mean to us as a community? It also means broadening our understanding of the things that kids go through. I've included in here this graphic of the realms of ACEs. We've been talking about things within the household, but there are also adverse childhood experiences that come through the community, whether it's crime within your neighborhoods, low socioeconomic status, poor housing, racism, gang violence. All of those kinds of things can contribute. And we're seeing increasingly as well adverse childhood experiences coming out of climate change, of kids who are experiencing repeated traumas of things like hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding. And unless we get a handle on it, that's going to exacerbate. I remember in 2020, 2021, somewhere in that neighborhood, there was a city in Houston or in Texas that just kept getting hit repeatedly by hurricanes. They had like 3 of them in the course of 8 weeks. And I thought about how difficult that trauma must have been for the children living in that community, because it was just so devastating and random. The graphic that you are seeing now, I call it the Wheel of Doom. But it basically talks about the increased risks within a population for people to experience these debilitating impacts of having experienced adverse childhood experiences unless we intervene. So this is without intervention. Things like an increased risk of 25.5% in cardiovascular disease, which might make you wonder, and then 24.3% increase in the risk of cancer. I was really puzzled by that, right? These are emotional things that happen, so why would things like cardiovascular disease and cancer be an impact? Well, it's because the drug that we first find as children to help us feel better is sugar. And if we never transition to things like cigarettes or drugs or alcohol, sugar remains our drug of choice and can lead to those impacts. One of the other things that I think is really significant is the 67.2% increase in life dissatisfaction, 61.4% increased risk for mental health issues. There's an increased risk of suicidality and depression and anxiety. But it can be managed if we understand why it needs to be done and take those steps to remediate. So we know that high ACEs can impact not only our mental health, but our physical well-being. And the chronic stress that comes from this kind of developmental trauma can reduce kids' ability to learn and to respond and to problem solve. And that's because of the brain regions that are being activated when they're under stress. It can also lower their tolerance for being stressed out and leading to fighting or to snapping or to acting defiantly or just checking out and shutting down. And that can make it really difficult to make friends, maintain relationships, and build on positive interactions. We also know that stress from ACEs can increase problems with learning and memory, and it can be permanent unless there's an intervention to rewire the brain. It can also affect our body's ability to fight infection, leading to more chronic illness. It can also increase the risk of drug and alcohol use and overeating, as we mentioned in the Wheel of Doom, which can also cause lasting health problems. So it's in everyone's interests that we intervene as early as possible in coping with these lifelong impacts, potentially, of adverse childhood experiences. And the thing to know about this, to remember, is that there is hope. It's not a death sentence. As terrible as it sounds, we know what causes it. It can create predictable pathways that we can also disrupt. So let's look at some more of how we can mitigate these adverse childhood experiences and create a positive and healthy life trajectory for our kids. So let's recognize, now we know it's a thing, let's recognize the impacts of trauma on development. This is a great graphic that I found that I thought really resonated with me. It's a quote by a man named Ryan North. He says, "Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewrites them for protection. And that's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people." So let's look at the neurobiology of trauma. This is a graphic that was created by my friend and colleague, Dr. Melissa Sadin, that gives a really quick and dirty overview of what the brain functions are. So in the front, in the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that's responsible for logic, for planning, for understanding consequences, the part that we engage when we're in school, when we are making plans for the future, when we are considering options. The hippocampus is in the center piece and down in the brain, and it's responsible for our emotional regulation, for memory, for language development, for executive functioning and processing speeds. The amygdala at the base in the back of the skull is our survival brain, and it's responsible for keeping us alive. It's its primary role. So now that we know what these basic structures do, let's look at an MRI of two brains. They're both 16-year-old males. One on the left is a normal, typical, developmentally appropriate brain. The one on the right is a child who had experienced traumatic experiences in early childhood. Knowing what we know about the three structures of the brain, you can see on the left in the prefrontal cortex for the normal, typical developing brain, it's lit up, it's red. This child is able to think, this child is able to reason, this child's able to make choices that make sense. The child on the right, you can see there's very little activity in the prefrontal cortex because if you look at the base, it's the amygdala that is in charge of this brain, with very little in the hippocampus area that's happening, where we have memory formation, language development, executive functioning. This particular graphic really is what resonated with me when I started learning about adverse childhood experiences, because it takes away the expectation of kids complying because we ask them to, because we tell them to. The part of the brain that makes those decisions is offline. It's like a computer that hasn't rebooted. So we are only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time. So if you have a kid whose amygdala is the part that is in charge, it's going to take about 20 minutes for all the stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline to work its way through the system and for the prefrontal cortex to reboot. So if you take nothing else from this little training, give the kids the 20 minutes and let them get back online so that you can re-engage with them in a healthy way, because otherwise it's like the Charlie Brown teacher, want, 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 want. There's no processing of what you're saying, and punishing them for not understanding or hearing what you're saying because this part's not working is counterproductive. So what does this look like when the amygdala is in charge? There are three phases. There's fight, flight, or freeze, and we don't get to pick what those are. Our body instinctively chooses what they think will give us the best chance for survival. So in the fight phase, you might see a kid who's oppositional, argumentative, stubborn, challenging authority, or dangerous or violent. They're trying to fight their way out of whatever is making them afraid. The flight kid is distracted, hyperactive, might be attention-seeking, might run off and hide somewhere, or exhibit avoidance behaviors of just, in the time they're taking to get out of whatever it is they're supposed to do, they could have done it 16 times over. In the freeze phase, kids can seem lazy, inattentive, not trying, they don't seem to care, staring off into space, being daydreamy. These are the kids whose instinctive response is to make themselves as invisible as possible. It's really challenging to differentiate this developmental trauma response sometimes from actual mental health conditions like attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, depression. These are all absolutely real things. but they can sometimes be misdiagnosed when it's actually trauma. So when the amygdala is activated, the thing to remember is that kids' behavior is not that they won't do it, it's that they can't. They need that 20 minutes. They need for this part to come back online so that they can engage with you. So there's also, sometimes we see physical symptoms. It's not always just behavioral or emotional. Sometimes kids will experience nausea, headaches, trembling, generally not feeling well. These are kids who often end up at the nurse's office, and the nurse can't find anything wrong, but the kid just doesn't feel well. There is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk that talks about how trauma stays within our bodies, and they can sometimes manifest in ways that are unexpected, and we didn't realize that was a thing that could be remembered. There also can be emotional signs like having flashbacks or memory gaps, bursts of fear or anger, and kids really pushing back on trying to keep people away from them because it's scary. So let's talk for a minute about what trauma looks like in children. So traumatized kids can often be hypervigilant. Their experiences have taught them that the world is not a safe place, so it's really difficult to let their guard down and to just be safe and at ease. So they're constantly scanning the room, looking for danger. It's a constant state of arousal that makes things like learning hard. If you are feeling afraid and you're scanning your environment, looking at all the people around you to see who is angry, who is a potential threat to me, and then simultaneously asking them to solve algebraic equations or read a paragraph and then write what they took from it to show their comprehension. It can be really, really difficult to do those dual things at the same time. There are also those kids who disengage in the freeze mode, that tune out. This is their way of dealing with the trauma by suppressing their emotions. So the key for all of this, of helping traumatized kids, is creating a sense of safety. That's really at the core of safety and connection, so that they feel like they are part of the community. I can also say that sometimes disrupted development in teens can be challenging. Teens are already dealing with their own developmental milestones of trying to differentiate their own personality, that they're trying to figure out how to live independently. For kids who've experienced trauma, this normal kind of development can be disrupted. For kids with healthy relationships with adults, they can come home, go out, try on being goth, come home, still be loved, go out trying to be a vegetarian, come home, feel safe, and then go out to be a rapper, whatever it happens to be. But for kids who've had this traumatic disruption of the brain, it can create a sense of distrust, which makes meeting those developmental milestones harder and can make coping strategies and trusting relationships all that more crucial to develop, but also more challenging to develop. So you got to hang in there with them. So the third pillar, we want to respond in a trauma-informed way. So what do we do when we see a kid who's having an episode? We want to, as we talked about, wait at least 15 to 20 minutes before we engage them for the prefrontal cortex to come back online. If there is a safety or security issue, obviously you need to address that, but for the most part, you don't want to try to touch them because that's going to send that fear signal out. And when they calm down, prefrontal cortex reboots, and you're ready to engage them, let them talk about what it was that upset them. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with you?" say, "What happened to you?" and give them a platform to be able to speak about what it was that made them feel afraid. Because at the core of all of these behaviors is fear. There is something that frightened them. If there are consequences for the behavior, then we want to explain what happens next. One of the big fears for kids who have been through stuff is not knowing what's going to happen. So we want to be able to give them as much structure and predictability as possible. The other thing I will tell you observationally, after having done this for many years, is there's a lot of times many of the kids that we work with will self-sabotage. They will do something, you put all this work and time and effort to get them to a place that's good and healthy and positive next step, and they'll self-sabotage. This is the reason why, because they fully expect things are going to go sideways. That's their experience. And if they cause it themselves, at least they know when, and they're not going to be blindsided when it happens. How do we engage the parasympathetic system to de-escalate the amygdala, right? There are a number of really solid suggestions and some research that backs up the efficacy of these. The top thing is mindfulness and meditation. That sounds very new agey sometimes, but it can be as simple as prayer. It could be as simple as staring at an object and thinking about all of the components of that object. It's to take you out of this part and re-engage this part. And pairing that with exercise like yoga and meditation, mindfulness and walking in the woods, going running, stretching, basketball, all of those things are as effective, according to some studies, as talk therapy and medication in managing these symptoms. Having good sleep is important. Strong nutrition, garbage in, garbage out, good things in, good things out. Breathing exercises is another one. It's actually the tool that I use when I become overwhelmed, of breathing in through your nose for the count of 5 and breathe out of your mouth through the count of 6. And doing that repeatedly can also help de-escalate the amygdala. Some other suggestions are art, things like puzzles, coloring. You saw the adult coloring book craze a few years ago. That is absolutely one of the things. Model airplanes, anything that is tactile, that you're using the creative part to express how you're feeling. Sometimes it's enough that we have to address the mental health needs. There are trauma-informed therapists throughout the country who can help with cognitive behavioral therapy with a trauma focus to help manage those symptoms. Another really important thing is to maintain a regular schedule. As I mentioned, these kids struggle. They are drawn towards chaos, but they struggle with chaos. So creating a regular schedule is really important. And the most important thing is creating an environment of safety, of trust. Be careful not just with what you say, but how you say it. You don't want to put a kid on edge by being really sharp with them. The research says that the number one intervention for kids who've been through trauma to recover is having a safe, caring, engaged relationship with a competent adult. Be that adult in their life. And we're happy to help in any way. If you ever want to reach out to our organization, it's info, I-N-F-O, at casashaw.org, CASASHAW.org. And if we can help, we will. So our last segment of the Being Trauma-Informed series is resist re-traumatization. So how do we do that? We want to understand first what some of those triggers are for re-traumatizing a kid. Feeling a lack of control, having unexpected changes, feeling threatened or attacked, feeling vulnerable or frightened, and shame are all components of that. So how do we avoid re-traumatizing kids? We want to provide controlled choices so that they feel empowered. Whichever one they choose matters not to you. Both are equally acceptable. We want to increase a child's sense of safety if they have to be separated from others. School phobia could be a component of this. So how do we help them feel safe? If kids do make mistakes, and they will, then we want to consider using restorative justice practices instead of punitive ones. How do we create a circumstance where they are welcomed back in full fellowship into our community when they've done something wrong, instead of just being punished and feel different and on the outside. As I mentioned before, these kids fully anticipate things are going to go badly for them. So we want to talk through consequences in advance and then let them be part of that planning process of what the consequence will be, if it's at all possible, so that they can see the justice of it and not just the punitive nature of it. We want to focus on their strengths. What are the things that they do well, even if they don't feel like they do them well? Because so many of our kids have compromised self-esteems. We want to be able to show them that they are good, show them that they are smart, show them that they are valued, and moderate your own tone and volume of your voice. It's really easy to lose it ourselves when we're frustrated, but you need to be mindful that for kids who've experienced trauma in childhood, they're hyper attuned to those kinds of things, and so modulate those. So in conclusion, the 4 R's of trauma: being trauma informed, to realize that it exists and understand victims' responses to stress and fear. 2, to learn the signs so we recognize it when we see it. 3, respond in a trauma-informed way so that we help kids build resilience and build trust with caring adults. And 4, be aware of our own actions and responses so that we resist re-traumatizing. So here's my final thought for this presentation. The very best thing that you can do is build an environment where all children feel valued, safe, respected, and heard. It goes a long way. Mr. Rogers, I'm a big fan. He says, we live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond, and I consider those people my heroes.